Imagine treating a forest to, prevent a catastrophic wildfire, and then calculating the carbon you save from going up in smoke and basically taking that proof straight to the bank.
Right. It sounds incredible.
It sounds like the ultimate climate win-win.
Yeah.
But there is just one massive problem. The actual rule book to cash that check literally does not exist.
Yeah. It is, it's a really beautiful theory that just completely collapses the absolute second you look at the ledger.
And that ledger is exactly what we are opening today. So if you've been following along with our deep dive into this topic, we've been exploring this whole idea that we can save our forests from severe fire by getting timber companies and conservationists to work together.
Which is a huge task on its own.
Oh, absolutely. But the lingering question we keep coming back to is, well, who actually writes the check to pay for all this?
Right.
So welcome to episode 12, The Bargain. This is the grand finale of our 12-part exploration into collaborative forest management. And our mission today is to unpack a single, highly comprehensive dossier that audits the reality of this entire model.
Yeah, and we've got 3 final questions we need to answer for you today. First, can this collaborative model actually be paid for? Second, does it successfully travel to other forests? And third, ultimately looking back, what was the bargain really worth?
Exactly. So to do that, we really have to treat this dossier as a strict audit of reality. We are looking at the hard data, the exact numbers, and the really dramatic policy shifts of 2025 and 2026.
And the physical reality of the forests themselves. We basically have to completely strip away all the wishful thinking that has surrounded this topic for, gosh, decades now.
Let's start with that first massive question. Funding. Can the model actually be paid for? Because the big hope for the last 20 years has been that thinning of forest to prevent a severe fire can somehow be funded by selling the avoided emissions as carbon credits.
Right. The logic is super appealing to people.
It is. You selectively log the woods, you reduce the fuel load, which prevents a catastrophic crown fire, then you just calculate the carbon that didn't burn, package it up, and sell it to a buyer who wants to offset their own emissions.
It sounds great, but here is the definitive finding from the audit, and it is absolutely critical that we understand this clearly. No registered avoided wildfire emissions methodology exists anywhere.
Wait, really? Nowhere at all?
Nowhere. Not at the American Carbon Registry, not at Vera, not at the Climate Action Reserve.
Those registries are they're the anchors of the entire market, right?
They are, but their improved forest management protocols were fundamentally built for a completely different purpose. They were designed to compensate private landowners for just delaying timber harvests on private ground.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they were never built to reward the thinning of federal lands to stop fires.
So just to make sure I'm picturing this right for you guys listening, after decades of people pointing to the carbon market as this sort of financial savior for forest restoration, there is literally no approved rule book for how to sell a carbon credit for avoiding a wildfire.
Exactly. There is zero accepted math. I mean, an attempt was made, and the failure of that attempt is incredibly telling. Back in 2015, a specific methodology for exactly this kind of southwestern forest restoration was drafted and submitted to the American Carbon Registry.
Okay, and what happened?
It went through an expert peer review panel, and that panel simply could not make the math work. Its status today remains completely inactive.
Wow.
Yeah, and right now the Forest Service is actually funding the development of a standard methodology, which is, arguably the clearest proof you could ever have that a usable one still doesn't exist today. I mean, there are academic proposals out there, but actual bankable credits, they do not exist.
Okay, so let's unpack why the math fails, because here's where it gets really fascinating for you. It basically comes down to probabilities.
Right. Huge probability distributions.
Yeah, it's like trying to sell a roofer's services to an insurance company based purely on the statistical chance that it might hail on one specific house this year. Physically, it costs anywhere from $2,000 to $2,500 to treat just one single acre of forest.
Which is not cheap.
Not at all. But because you can never know exactly where a lightning strike will happen or how a fire is going to behave on the landscape, you have to treat roughly 10 different locations just to guarantee you influence one single fire.
Exactly.
Which means 90% of the acres you just paid thousands of dollars to treat yield absolutely avoided fire carbon benefit. The fire just never hits them.
And that is exactly where the physical reality of the forest completely collides with the strict financial requirements of a carbon market. But, it actually goes deeper. Let's look at the broader market audit. Because even if you completely set aside the wildfire issue, The carbon market that people are hoping will foot this bill is itself facing incredible scrutiny. We need to look at the exact numbers here. Independent analysis of improved forest management projects in California found that 29.4% of analyzed credits were overcredited.
Wait, 29.4%?
Yes.
I mean, that's not a rounding error or like a minor accounting glitch. That is a systemic failure.
Yeah.
So are they intentionally cooking the books, or is the measurement system itself just fundamentally broken?
It's the latter. It primarily comes down to something called species-blind baselines. And the mechanism here is vital to understand. When a carbon project calculates its baseline, which basically means establishing what would have happened to the forest if the project didn't exist, they often used broad regional averages.
Right.
But those averages completely failed to distinguish between radically different tree species.
Let me try to put an analogy to this. Using a species-blind baseline sounds a lot like calculating the fuel savings of buying a hybrid Prius by comparing it to the average miles per gallon of literally every vehicle on the road,
Yeah, exactly.
including diesel semi-trucks and delivery vans. You artificially inflate your savings by comparing yourself to an incredibly inaccurate, generic baseline.
That is a perfect analogy. By understating what a typical landowner would have naturally done with those specific trees, the project drastically inflates the gap it can claim as a carbon benefit. It looks great on a spreadsheet, but the atmosphere doesn't care about the spreadsheet.
No, it doesn't.
And the structural problems get even worse when we examine permanence. The system relies on something called a buffer pool.
Right, the insurance fund.
Exactly. Think of the buffer pool as the centralized insurance fund of carbon credits, designed to absorb and manage all the accidental losses like unexpected fires or disease across the entire program for a century. Well, in under a decade, that buffer pool lost about a fifth of its total.
A fifth in under 10 years. So if we synthesize this first movement for you, we are looking at a scenario where the specific rulebook needed to fund our collaborative forest model literally does not exist.
Yep.
And the broader carbon market, which was supposed to be the endless well of cash, is buckling under the weight of its own flawed math and rapidly depleting insurance funds.
Precisely. Which means private carbon money is essentially a ghost. And if the private market cannot pay for the collaborative model, the entire financial burden falls squarely back onto the government.
Which takes us directly into the second movement of our audit today, the policy environment of 2025 and 2026. Because the government radically changed the rules of how these forests are managed, didn't they?
They absolutely did. The collaborative model received what looks like this genuine balance of incredible procedural gifts and, at the exact same time, devastating operational subtractions.
Let's look at those procedural gifts first. Because legally speaking, the collaborative model got basically everything it ever asked for. In 2025, the Supreme Court granted substantial deference to agencies regarding the scope of environmental impact statements.
Right, which was huge.
Yeah, for you listening, this basically means it became incredibly difficult for a single interest group to successfully sue and halt a logging project just by claiming the environmental review wasn't deep enough.
Exactly. And then environmental regulations from the Council on Environmental Quality were rescinded. We saw categorical exclusions, which are essentially these legal fast passes that allow agencies to skip years-long, 1,000-page environmental reviews for certain projects, centralized and made stackable.
Stackable fast passes.
Yeah, and to top it all off, there was an emergency determination covering 112.6 million acres of the National Forest System.
112.6 million acres.
Yeah.
That's massive.
Yeah.
And we saw the downstream effect of that procedural friction disappearing almost immediately.
Yeah, we did. Expedited reviews processed 8.8 million acres in a single fiscal year. Money even moved toward mill infrastructure, and for the very first time, federal firefighters working prescribed burns received hazard pay.
Wow.
Procedurally, the agency was handed the strongest tailwind in 40 years to get work done.
But, and this is a staggering contradiction currently, the actual operation on the ground completely collapsed.
It really did.
The agency got the ultimate procedural playbook to move fast, but they suddenly lost all their players.
Because you cannot run a labor-intensive collaborative model without labor. That is the physical reality. In the first half of 2025, the Forest Service lost roughly 16% of its workforce through departures, buyouts, and early retirements.
16% is the massive hit to institutional knowledge.
Absolutely. Furthermore, research and partnership funding, the specific budget lines that actually pay for the neutral science that brings timber executives and conservation groups to the same table were entirely zeroed out.
So what happens when you have unlimited authority, but no staff and no science funding? Well, we have the exact numbers on what that did to the actual output, and they are stark.
Very stark.
In a single year, treatment acres fell about 35%. Prescribed fire fell roughly half.
Yeah.
You simply cannot produce treated acres with a streamlined process if you do not have the boots on the ground to hold a drip torch or run a feller buncher.
No, you can't. And we must point out a major data discrepancy here out loud so you have the complete picture.
Sure.
When we examine that drop in treatment acres, the agency's own fiscal year reporting claims 3.3 million acres were treated.
Okay, 3.3 million.
However, independent analyses looking at the agency's own field records but measured on a calendar year show only 2.6 million acres treated.
That is a big gap.
It is. They use completely different periods, they use different definitions of what constitutes a treatment, and they do not reconcile. And we are not picking a side between those two numbers. The critical takeaway is that both sources show the direction is decidedly down in the very year the agency's legal authorities massively expanded.
Right. And this tension ultimately culminated in what we can call the squeeze. And it really centered around the sudden reopening of roughly 2 million acres of Washington roadless area on a 34-day comment window.
Yeah, this is a vital point.
We really need to hold this in a genuine, objective balance here, because both sides of this argument are at full strength. On one hand, the case that this frictionless environment helps agency restoration is incredibly strong.
Right. The agency can easily argue that they hardly ever log those steep roadless areas anyway, and stripping away the bureaucratic red tape simply allows them to tackle the wildfire crisis without being bogged down in endless litigation.
That is a very strong case. But on the other hand, the case that this unilateral action undermines the fundamental trust of the collaborative bargain is equally strong.
Exactly. We have to remember what the core currency of this bargain was. Roadless protection was the consideration. Conservation groups historically accepted active, mechanized logging in certain front country areas, specifically because they received a written, formalized commitment that the remote roadless country would not be touched.
So reopening those roadless areas unilaterally on a brief 34-day comment window forces local partners to ask what their hard-won signature on that agreement was actually worth.
And both of those realities are true at once. The environment gave the model everything it asked for procedurally and took away everything it needed operationally.
Which perfectly tees up our third question. Does this collaborative model actually travel? Over the course of this series, we've spent a lot of time on what we call the Vajan model.
Right, the flagship project.
Yeah, this flagship project on the Colville National Forest, where a highly specialized mill and local conservationists successfully partnered up. Can you pick that Vagan model up and drop it into any forest town in America?
Well, the data tells a very specific, very localized story. The model requires a rare convergence of 3 strict preconditions. First, you need a mill specifically engineered for small logs.
Meaning machinery that can somehow make a profit turning trees just 4.5 inches wide into lumber.
Exactly. Second, you need nearby value-added capacity, like a mass timber plant, so that small diameter wood has somewhere better to go than just a low-value wood chip pile.
Right.
And third, you need incredibly high social trust. You need historical adversaries who are willing to sit in a room together for a decade without suing each other.
So knowing how incredibly strict those preconditions are, what is the reality of replicating it? Did this flagship success story actually spread?
It spread to exactly one additional project.
Right.
Just one. And that one additional project was on the exact same national forest. Repeated searching surfaced no similar contract model replicating this success on any other national forest.
Oh, wow. So it really didn't travel at all.
It didn't. And the infrastructure is highly vulnerable, too. The mass timber plant, located right next door to the flagship mill, was eventually sold back to the sawmill as the broader market for cross-laminated timber struggled.
And what about the social trust aspect?
Well, the Conservation Coalition's public feed hasn't been updated since December 2023.
So what we've learned is that you cannot just legislate social trust into existence.
Yeah.
And you certainly can't magically appropriate a multi-million-dollar small log mill into existence within hauling distance of a high-risk fire.
No, you can't.
And here is a detail from the audit that I found absolutely striking. There isn't even a public monitoring report detailing the flagship project's outcomes.
Yeah, that's a huge issue.
Think about that. If you cannot objectively evaluate the ecological and financial results of the model, you simply cannot responsibly export it to a new community.
And that absence of evaluation naturally brings us to the fourth and final movement of our deep dive, the verdict. We must deliver this plainly, without triumph and without elegy. The vegan model is real, but it is emphatically not a carbon strategy.
Right, the physics of it just don't support the carbon narrative. Mechanically thinning a forest actually costs carbon in the short term.
Because you are physically removing biomass from the woods and running heavy diesel equipment to do it.
Exactly. The ecosystem only repays that carbon debt after 40 to 50 years. And it only repays it if, and only if, the initial thinning is diligently followed by repeated prescribed fire, and a severe wildfire actually happens to hit that specific treated stand.
Right. If the big fire never comes, the thinned forest never separates from the unthinned control forest in terms of carbon benefit.
But just because it is not a carbon strategy does not mean it is a fraud.
No, it is not a fraud. The concrete evidence against that is strong and visible. The mill survived in a rural county that lost its other major industrial facility decades ago.
Right, tangible ecological work was actually done.
Exactly. Culverts were replaced, which successfully restored streams for aquatic life. The forest was actually treated at record volumes to reduce immediate fire risk. And historical adversaries genuinely sat in a room together for 13 years without suing each other.
So if it wasn't a carbon offset and it wasn't a scam, what was it? It was exactly what we titled this episode. It was a bargain. Plain and simple.
Yeah.
It was peace for wood. It was restraint for treatment. It was patience for time. Conservation groups willingly gave up their traditional litigation leverage so they could get the ecological treatments they wanted.
And the timber industry accepted limits on where they could cut to get the steady supply of wood they needed to keep the lights on.
And the federal agency got projects that actually moved instead of dying in a courtroom.
And what ultimately broke that bargain wasn't malicious bad faith from the locals. It was an agency that simply stopped needing the deal, coupled with a national policy environment that made the deal cheaper to walk away from than to keep.
Right.
When a federal agency can move unilaterally and reliably win in court on procedural deference, sitting at a collaborative table for 18 grueling months of compromise costs more than it returns. The math of collaboration just stopped making sense.
As we close out episode 12 and this entire 12-part journey, we're going to step back. We want to leave you with an audio note we received to close out the series. We are handing the final word over to the man who compiled the very dossier we've been auditing today, Nick McKenzie.
It's a really powerful reflection.
We want to play it for you now, unsentimentally, to close the book on the restoration bargain.
I want to end where this started because it is the only ground in the series I have actually walked. Northern Idaho, 1976 into 77. I was at the Forest Service Laboratory in a town called Moscow, and my job was a chainsaw. We were doing a growth study on Douglas fir, destructive sampling. You fall the tree, buck the stem into sections, cut a disc at each one, and somebody counts the rings out from the pith, measuring every year's width. A growth model is a very careful statement about the past projected forward on the assumption that the past is still in charge. That is what Albert Stage built the prognosis model out of, which became the forest vegetation simulator, which is still generating carbon reports today. But a disc will not tell you what happens 100 years from now, because every ring was laid down under a climate, a fire regime, and a set of neighbors that will not be the ones the next 100 rings get. I work in forestry and in the carbon offset market. I work on the measuring end, the unglamorous plumbing that proved the buffer pools were missized and reported that the methodologies did not exist. I have never worked on the Colville National Forest in Northeast Washington or in British Columbia. I did not see the marking crews or the coalition room, but I know what it means to spend a career on the measuring end of a question this large. You do not get to see the answer. You get to make sure that whenever it arrives, it is built on something that was actually counted. The bargain held for 13 years. The trees left standing will be there for 150 if the fire lets them. Nobody alive will know who was right. What happens when the models and algorithms that dictate our present actions are built entirely on a climate and a past that no longer exists? Like and subscribe. It really helps the channel reach others.